In the heart of occupied Europe, where swastika flags cast long shadows over cobblestone streets, millions of ordinary people faced an extraordinary test of survival. This is the story of how one civilian navigated the treacherous waters of life under the Nazi regime during World War II. It's not a tale of heroes or resistance fighters, but of someone who simply tried to live through one of history's darkest chapters. Their experience reveals the complex reality of daily existence when tyranny becomes the norm and every decision carries life or death consequences. Understanding this civilian's journey matters because it illuminates a perspective often overshadowed by military narratives and resistance stories. While historians document battles and political decisions, the lived experience of ordinary people under occupation remains crucial to comprehending the true impact of totalitarian rule. These personal accounts provide insight into the psychological, moral, and practical challenges faced by millions who had no choice but to endure. They remind us that history isn't just made by generals and politicians, but lived by everyday people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. In this presentation, we'll examine the documented experiences of civilian life under Nazi occupation, exploring the systems of control, the daily struggles for survival, and the moral complexities faced by those who lived through this period. We'll look at rationing systems, propaganda exposure, forced labor policies, and the constant surveillance that defined existence under the regime. We'll also address the difficult questions about collaboration, resistance, and the gray areas between survival and complicity. Our focus remains on factual accounts drawn from historical records, survivor testimonies, and scholarly research to paint an accurate picture of this harrowing time. This account draws from extensive historical documentation, including archived personal diaries, post-war testimonies, and academic research on civilian life during World War II. The experiences described represent composite elements from multiple verified sources, as individual privacy and historical accuracy require careful consideration. Historians have spent decades collecting and analyzing these testimonies, cross-referencing them with official Nazi records, Allied intelligence reports, and contemporary documentation. This research provides us with a detailed understanding of the mechanisms of control and the strategies civilians employed to survive under occupation. To fully grasp how one person survived this nightmare, we must first understand the systematic transformation that occurred when the Nazis took control of civilian life. The occupation didn't happen overnight, and neither did the implementation of the regime's most oppressive policies. Instead, it was a gradual tightening of control that began with seemingly minor restrictions and escalated into total domination of every aspect of daily existence. The mechanisms they employed were both brutally efficient and psychologically devastating, designed to break resistance before it could form. When Nazi forces occupied a territory, they implemented a carefully designed system of control that had been refined through earlier occupations. The first phase involved establishing administrative authority through local collaborators and German officials who understood the region. Within weeks, new laws appeared on posted notices throughout towns and cities, each one restricting another aspect of freedom. These regulations covered everything from curfews and travel restrictions to prohibitions on listening to foreign radio broadcasts. The systematic nature of these controls revealed a regime that had studied how to dominate civilian populations with ruthless efficiency. The identification system formed the backbone of Nazi control over occupied populations. Every civilian was required to carry papers at all times, with different colored documents or markings indicating ethnicity, occupation, and authorized movements. Checkpoints appeared on major roads and at city entrances, where soldiers demanded to see these documents multiple times daily. For Jewish civilians and other targeted groups, identification papers carried special markings that immediately subjected them to additional scrutiny and restrictions. This system meant that simply moving through your own city became an exercise in navigating bureaucratic terror, where forgotten papers could mean arrest or worse. Rationing controlled not just what people ate, but their entire relationship with basic survival. Each household received ration cards that determined monthly allocations of bread, meat, dairy, vegetables, and fuel. The Nazi authorities deliberately set ration levels for occupied populations below adequate nutrition standards, creating chronic hunger that sapped energy and resistance. Black markets emerged in every occupied city, where civilians risked severe punishment to obtain additional food through illegal channels. The regime understood that hungry people focused on survival rather than resistance, making food scarcity a deliberate tool of oppression rather than merely a wartime necessity. Propaganda saturated every aspect of public life under occupation. Loudspeakers in town squares broadcast Nazi messaging throughout the day. Cinemas were required to show German newsreels before any film. Schools implemented new curricula, emphasizing Nazi ideology and German superiority. Newspapers came under strict control, publishing only approved content that portrayed the occupation as beneficial and resistance as futile. This constant bombardment of messaging aimed to reshape how people thought about their situation, normalizing the occupation and isolating them from accurate information about the war's progress or resistance movements elsewhere. The surveillance apparatus extended beyond official police and military forces into the fabric of community life itself. The Gestapo recruited informants from local populations, creating networks of civilians who reported on their neighbors' activities and conversations. Block wardens monitored residential areas, noting unusual gatherings or suspicious behavior. Even children were encouraged to report adults who spoke against the regime. This atmosphere of mutual suspicion meant that trust became a luxury few could afford, as any conversation might be reported, and any friendship might conceal an informant. Understanding this surveillance network is essential to comprehending the isolation and paranoia that characterized daily life under occupation. The civilian whose story we're following lived in a mid-sized European city that fell under Nazi control in the early years of World War II. When German forces arrived, the initial occupation seemed almost bureaucratic, with soldiers posting notices and establishing administrative offices rather than immediately implementing harsh measures. Many civilians hoped that cooperation would lead to tolerable conditions, a hope the Nazis deliberately encouraged during the early transition period. This initial phase of relative calm was strategic, designed to identify potential resistors and establish control before implementing more oppressive policies. Within weeks, however, the true nature of occupation became undeniably clear. The first personal impact came through employment restrictions. Our civilian had worked as a clerk in a municipal office, a position that provided modest but stable income. Under new regulations, all government employees were required to sign loyalty oaths to the occupying authority and undergo background checks examining family heritage and political affiliations. Those who refused to sign lost their positions immediately. Those whose backgrounds revealed Jewish ancestry, communist sympathies, or other undesirable characteristics were dismissed regardless of their willingness to cooperate. The choice was stark. Sign away your principles or lose your livelihood and become subject to forced labor assignments. After signing the required documents, our civilian retained employment but under dramatically changed conditions. German supervisors replaced local administrators, and all work now served the occupation's goals. The office processed paperwork related to resource extraction, labor assignments, and population monitoring. Every task contributed to the machinery of control, creating a moral burden that weighed heavily on those who performed it. Yet refusing to work meant losing ration cards, facing arrest for vagrancy, and likely assignment to forced labor in factories or agricultural work under far harsher conditions. The occupation excelled at creating situations where every choice involved some form of complicity. Home life transformed as well. The apartment our civilians shared with an elderly parent became subject to random inspections by German soldiers searching for contraband, hidden persons, or resistance materials. Radios were confiscated or sealed to prevent access to Allied broadcasts, cutting off reliable information about the war's progress. The evening curfew meant that after a certain hour, anyone on the streets risked arrest or being shot on sight. Social gatherings of more than a few people required permits. Even private conversations had to be conducted carefully, as walls were thin and neighbors might report seditious talk. The home, once a refuge, became another space of surveillance and control. The psychological impact of these early months proved as significant as the physical restrictions. The constant low-level fear, the endless small humiliations, and the awareness of being utterly powerless created a stress that never fully subsided. Sleep became difficult as every unusual sound might signal a nighttime raid. Appetite diminished. Despite the constant hunger from inadequate rations, trust eroded as people withdrew into themselves, afraid that any connection might prove dangerous. This psychological warfare was intentional, designed to break spirits and eliminate resistance before it could organize. As our civilian adapted to this new reality, the question became not how to resist, but simply how to survive each day without drawing fatal attention. Survival under occupation required developing a completely new set of skills and instincts. Our civilian learned to read the moods of German soldiers at checkpoints, understanding which ones might be reasoned with and which ones were looking for excuses to demonstrate power. Body language became crucial, appearing neither defiant nor servile, maintaining eye contact without seeming challenging, moving with purpose but not haste. These subtle performances occurred multiple times daily, each one a small test where failure might mean arrest. Over time, this constant performance became exhausting, a theater of survival where every interaction followed a script designed to avoid punishment. The black market became essential for supplementing inadequate official rations. Our civilian developed contacts with farmers outside the city who would trade food for valuables, clothing, or services. These transactions carried enormous risk, as both buyer and seller faced severe penalties if caught. Meetings occurred in carefully chosen locations at specific times with coded phrases to confirm identities. The food obtained this way, extra potatoes, a bit of meat, some butter, made the difference between slow starvation and maintaining enough strength to work. Yet each transaction meant becoming more deeply involved in the illegal economy, accumulating risk that could be used against you if authorities chose to investigate. Navigating the bureaucracy of occupation required constant attention to changing regulations. New restrictions appeared weekly on posted notices that civilians were required to read and obey immediately. Failure to comply with regulations you hadn't seen posted was no excuse. Our civilian developed a routine of checking notice boards daily, memorizing new rules about curfew times, restricted areas, required documentation, and prohibited activities. Keeping track of these ever-changing requirements became a survival skill in itself. One forgotten regulation could lead to arrest, interrogation, and potential deportation to labor. Camps where survival rates were devastatingly low. The moral compromises required for survival created internal conflicts that never fully resolved. Working in an office that processed paperwork for the occupation meant contributing to the system's efficiency. Obtaining extra food through black market contacts meant having resources that others lacked. Remaining silent when neighbors were arrested meant preserving your own safety at the cost of others. Our civilians struggled with these compromises, understanding that survival often required actions that contradicted deeply held values. There were no clean choices, only degrees of complicity and collaboration that each person had to navigate according to their own conscience and circumstances. Small acts of humanity became precious in this environment of systematic dehumanization. A German soldier who looked the other way when papers were slightly out of order. A neighbor who shared information about upcoming raids. A shopkeeper who occasionally slipped extra items into purchases without recording them. These moments of kindness and solidarity provided psychological sustenance that was nearly as important as physical survival. They reminded people that humanity persisted even under conditions designed to destroy it. As winter approached and conditions worsened, these connections would become even more critical to maintaining the will to continue surviving. Winter brought new dimensions of hardship to life. Under occupation, fuel rations proved woefully inadequate for heating homes during the coldest months. Our civilians' apartment, already drafty and poorly insulated, became nearly uninhabitable as temperatures dropped. The official fuel allocation lasted perhaps 3 weeks of the winter season, forcing impossible choices about when to heat the apartment and when to simply endure the cold. Wearing multiple layers of clothing to bed became standard practice. Water pipes froze regularly, requiring trips to public pumps where lines formed before dawn. The cold sapped energy and weakened immune systems already compromised by inadequate nutrition. Food scarcity intensified dramatically during winter months. The vegetables that had supplemented official rations during summer and fall disappeared. Root vegetables stored from harvest became increasingly scarce and expensive on black markets. Bread portions shrank as grain supplies dwindled. Our civilian's elderly parent, already weakened by the stress of occupation, began showing signs of malnutrition, swollen joints, persistent fatigue, and difficulty concentrating. The official ration provided perhaps 100 to 200 calories daily, well below what was needed for health, especially in cold conditions. Watching a loved one slowly weaken from hunger while being powerless to adequately help created a particular agony that many families experienced during this period. The occupation authorities used winter hardship strategically. They announced that additional fuel and food rations would be available to those who volunteered for specific work assignments or provided information about resistance activities. This created divisions within communities, as some people accepted these offers while others refused on principle. Our civilian faced pressure to volunteer for extended work hours in exchange for supplemental rations that could help the ailing parent. The choice involved weighing immediate physical needs against longer-term moral and practical considerations. Accepting meant becoming more visible to authorities and more deeply integrated into the occupation's machinery. Illness spread rapidly through the malnourished, cold, and stressed population. Respiratory infections, influenza, and tuberculosis found easy victims in bodies weakened by months of inadequate food and shelter. Medical care had deteriorated significantly under occupation, with many doctors conscripted or fled, medicines diverted to military use, and hospitals operating under German control. Our civilian's parent developed a persistent cough that worsened throughout the winter. Obtaining medical attention required navigating bureaucratic hurdles and often paying bribes to German administrators who controlled access to healthcare. The fear that a treatable illness might become fatal due to lack of medical resources haunted many families during this time. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, small communities of mutual support formed among trusted neighbors. Our civilian developed a careful network of 3 other families who shared resources, information, and emotional support. They took turns checking on each other's elderly relatives, shared black market contacts, and warned each other about upcoming inspections or raids. These networks operated on trust built slowly over months of careful observation. One informant could destroy an entire network, so expansion was cautious and deliberate. As winter deepened and survival became more precarious, these bonds of solidarity provided both practical assistance and the psychological sustenance needed to face each difficult day. The connections formed during this first winter would prove crucial as the occupation continued and conditions deteriorated further. As the war intensified and German labor shortages grew critical, the occupation authorities implemented increasingly aggressive forced labor policies. New regulations required all able-bodied civilians not employed in essential services to register for work assignments. Our civilian, already employed in the municipal office, initially seemed exempt from these requirements. However, the criteria for essential services narrowed steadily as the regime's labor demands grew. Workers in administrative positions faced pressure to accept additional assignments or risk reclassification as available for deportation to factories in Germany. The threat of forced deportation hung over every household, creating constant anxiety about which family members might be taken next. The selection process for forced labor assignments revealed the occupation's brutal efficiency. German labor officials conducted periodic reviews of the civilian workforce, examining age, health, skills, and family circumstances. Those deemed most productive and least likely to resist were prioritized for deportation to German factories and farms. Young, healthy workers without dependent children faced the highest risk. Our civilian's age and responsibility for an elderly parent provided some protection, but this protection felt increasingly fragile as quotas increased and selection criteria broadened. Each new round of selections meant watching neighbors and co-workers disappear, loaded onto trains with minimal notice and uncertain destinations. The conditions reported by those who returned from forced labor assignments were harrowing. Workers described 12 to 16-hour shifts in munitions factories, inadequate food that left them constantly hungry, and crowded barracks where disease spread rapidly. Injuries from industrial accidents were common, and medical care was minimal. Some workers never returned, dying from exhaustion, illness, or workplace accidents. Others came back so physically broken that they could no longer work, becoming burdens on families already struggling to survive. These accounts circulated through whispered conversations, creating terror about what deportation actually meant while simultaneously being impossible to verify or prevent. Our civilian witnessed the selection process firsthand when German officials arrived at the municipal office to review personnel files. They examined each worker's documentation, asking questions about skills, health, and family circumstances. Several younger colleagues were immediately designated for factory work in Germany, given 2 days to settle their affairs before mandatory departure. The arbitrariness of the process was striking. One person was selected while another with nearly identical circumstances was passed over. There seemed to be quotas to fill, rather than rational criteria being applied. The selected workers left in a state of shock, and those who remained felt a mixture of relief and guilt, knowing their temporary reprieve came at others' expense. The threat of forced labor deportation became a tool of control that extended beyond the actual selections. Civilians who failed to comply with regulations, missed work without authorization, or were suspected of black market activities faced deportation as punishment. This threat hung over every interaction with authorities, every minor infraction, every moment of daily life. Parents lived in fear for their children of working age. The elderly worried about what would happen to them if their caregivers were taken. Our civilian understood that the fragile protection provided by current employment and family circumstances could evaporate at any moment. As the war continued and German losses mounted, the labor demands would only intensify, making deportation seem less a possibility and more an inevitability that was simply being delayed. Resistance under occupation rarely looked like the dramatic acts depicted in films and novels. Most civilians engaged in what historians call everyday resistance. Small acts of non-compliance, subtle sabotage, and quiet solidarity that didn't rise to the level of organized opposition, but nonetheless hindered the occupation's goals. Our civilian participated in this invisible resistance through seemingly minor actions that carried significant risk. Processing paperwork slowly, losing documents that would have identified people for deportation, providing incorrect information about resource availability. These small acts of bureaucratic resistance occurred within the system while undermining its efficiency. The cumulative effect of thousands of civilians engaging in similar small acts of non-compliance created friction in the occupation machinery. The risks of even minor resistance were severe and unpredictable. The Gestapo and local collaborators remained alert for any signs of non-cooperation or sabotage. Workers suspected of deliberate inefficiency faced interrogation, and those found guilty of sabotage could be executed as examples to others. Our civilian witnessed the arrest of a colleague who had been caught deliberately miscalculating resource inventories. The man disappeared into the detention system, and his family received no information about his fate for months. Eventually, word came that he had been sent to a concentration camp. The message was clear: even small acts of resistance carried potentially fatal consequences. Yet people continued these acts anyway, driven by the need to maintain some sense of agency and moral integrity. Information became a form of resistance. Despite prohibitions against listening to foreign radio broadcasts, some civilians maintained hidden radios or found ways to access BBC broadcasts and other allied news sources. Our civilians' small network of trusted neighbors included someone who had successfully concealed a radio and shared information about the war's actual progress. This information contradicted the propaganda that portrayed German victory as inevitable and resistance as futile. Knowing that Allied forces were advancing, even slowly, provided psychological sustenance that helped people endure present hardships. The risk of being caught with an illegal radio or sharing forbidden information meant arrest and likely execution, but the need for truthful information drove people to take these risks. Helping targeted populations represented the most dangerous form of civilian resistance. Jewish neighbors and other persecuted groups faced deportation to concentration camps, and those who helped them hide or escape faced execution if discovered. Our civilian faced this moral crisis when a Jewish family from the building received deportation orders. The family had been neighbors for years, and their desperation was heartbreaking. Providing help meant risking not only your own life, but also endangering your family and anyone else in your network. Our civilian struggled with this decision, understanding both the moral imperative to help and the practical reality that being caught would mean death for everyone involved. The decision made in such moments revealed the impossible, choices that defined life under occupation. The psychological burden of resistance, even minor resistance, proved exhausting. Every small act of non-compliance required careful calculation of risks and consequences. The constant vigilance needed to avoid detection created stress that never fully subsided. Our civilian lived with the knowledge that a single mistake, one moment of carelessness, could lead to arrest and interrogation. The Gestapo's interrogation methods were notorious, and people knew that under torture, they might reveal information that would endanger others. This awareness meant that every act of resistance, no matter how small, carried weight that extended far beyond the act itself. As the occupation continued, the question became not whether to resist, but how to resist in ways that provided meaningful opposition while maintaining enough security to survive and continue resisting. The systematic deportation of Jewish populations from occupied territories represented the Nazi regime's most horrific policy, and civilians witnessed these deportations with varying degrees of awareness and response. Our civilian city had a Jewish population of several thousand before the occupation, people who had been neighbors, shopkeepers, teachers, and colleagues. The deportations began gradually, with notices requiring Jewish residents to register at specific locations, then restrictions on where they could live and work, and finally the creation of a ghetto in a specific district of the city. Each step normalized the next, creating a progression toward atrocity that many civilians failed to recognize until it was too late to effectively oppose. The ghetto's creation transformed a vibrant neighborhood into an enclosed prison. German soldiers and local police erected barriers around several blocks, forcing all Jewish residents into this confined area. Families were given hours to pack what they could carry and move to assigned buildings within the ghetto. Our civilian watched these forced relocations from a distance, seeing families carrying suitcases and bundles through the streets under armed guard. The non-Jewish residents of the ghetto district were relocated to vacated Jewish homes, creating a population transfer that disrupted entire communities. The ghetto walls made the Jewish population invisible to most civilians, allowing many to avoid confronting what was happening to their former neighbors. Conditions in the ghetto deteriorated rapidly. Severe overcrowding meant multiple families sharing apartments designed for single families. Food rations for ghetto residents were set even lower than those for other civilians, creating starvation conditions. Disease spread quickly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Our civilian occasionally saw ghetto residents working in labor details outside the walls, supervised by guards. They appeared gaunt and exhausted, moving with the slow deliberation of people conserving energy they didn't have. Some civilians tried to pass food or supplies to these workers, acts of kindness that were forbidden and punished severely if detected. The ghetto existed as a parallel world of suffering that most civilians were encouraged to ignore. The deportations from the ghetto to concentration camps began without warning. German soldiers surrounded the ghetto early one morning and began systematically removing residents. Families were separated, with able-bodied workers sent to labor camps and others, the elderly, children, and those deemed unfit for work, sent to destinations that were officially described as resettlement areas, but were actually extermination camps. Our civilian heard the commotion from a distance, shouting, crying, occasional gunshots. The deportations continued for days, with trains departing regularly. Most civilians understood that something terrible was happening, but lacked specific information about the true nature of these deportations. The regime's euphemistic language and strict information control meant that many people genuinely didn't know about the extermination camps until after the war. The moral weight of witnessing these deportations without being able to stop them haunted many civilians for the rest of their lives. Our civilian felt the guilt of survival, of having been born into a category that the regime didn't target for extermination. There were moments when help might have been possible, hiding someone, providing false papers, offering food, but each of these actions carried risks that seemed insurmountable at the time. The question of what more could have been done, what more should have been done, remained unanswerable. As the ghetto emptied and the Jewish population of the city effectively disappeared, the absence left a void that was both physical and moral. The deportations demonstrated the occupation's capacity for systematic atrocity and the limits of civilian resistance against organized genocide. These events would shape how our civilians understood their own survival and the price that others paid for the regime's ideology. By the middle years of World War II, subtle changes in the occupation's character began to emerge. Allied bombing campaigns started reaching cities in occupied territories, targeting industrial facilities and transportation infrastructure. Our civilian experienced the first air raid sirens with a mixture of fear and strange hope. The bombs represented danger, but they also signaled that the Allies were fighting back and that German control wasn't absolute. The occupation authorities imposed strict blackout regulations, requiring all windows to be covered at night and prohibiting any lights that might help enemy bombers identify targets. Violations resulted in severe punishment, as the regime grew increasingly paranoid about sabotage and resistance as military pressures mounted. The German military's changing fortunes affected conditions in occupied territories. As losses mounted on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, the occupation authorities became more demanding and more brutal. Resource extraction intensified, with food requisitions increasing, even as local populations were already malnourished. Factory production quotas rose, requiring longer work hours and more forced labor deportations. Our civilian noticed that German soldiers and administrators seemed more stressed and less confident than in the early occupation years. The propaganda that had portrayed inevitable German victory began to ring hollow as the war dragged on without the promised swift conclusion. These changes created a strange tension. Conditions worsened, even as hope for eventual liberation grew. Resistance activities increased as the occupation's grip weakened slightly. Partisan groups operating in rural areas became more active, conducting sabotage operations against railways, communication lines, and German supply convoys. The occupation authorities responded with collective punishment policies, executing civilians in retaliation for partisan attacks, and implementing stricter controls in areas where resistance was strongest. Our civilian city experienced several incidents where German installations were attacked, followed by mass arrests and public executions of suspected resistance members. These executions were conducted in public squares, forcing civilians to witness the consequences of resistance. The message was clear: opposition would be met with overwhelming brutality. News of Allied advances reached civilians through forbidden radio broadcasts and whispered conversations. The successful Allied invasion of Italy, the advances on the Eastern Front, and eventually the D-Day landings in Normandy provided concrete evidence that Germany was losing the war. This information spread through informal networks despite the regime's efforts to control it. Our civilians' trusted neighbor with the hidden radio shared updates carefully, understanding that even discussing Allied victories could be construed as sedition. The knowledge that liberation might eventually come provided psychological sustenance during this difficult period, helping people endure present hardships with the hope that they were temporary rather than permanent conditions. However, the period between recognizing that Germany would likely lose the war and actual liberation proved to be one of the most dangerous. The occupation authorities, facing inevitable defeat, became more erratic and brutal. Some officials began destroying records and eliminating witnesses to their crimes. Others intensified their exploitation of occupied territories, extracting everything possible before retreat became necessary. Our civilian understood that survival now required navigating not just the established occupation system, but also the chaos of a regime in its death throes. The final phase of occupation would test survival skills in new ways, as desperation replaced the cold efficiency that had characterized earlier years. The hope of liberation had to be balanced against the very real danger that the regime might destroy everything and everyone as it fell. The last winter of occupation brought conditions that made previous hardships seem almost bearable by comparison. Allied bombing campaigns had destroyed significant infrastructure, including transportation networks that brought food and fuel to cities. The occupation authorities, focused on military needs and increasingly disorganized, provided almost no support to civilian populations. Official rations shrank to starvation levels, sometimes providing less than 800 calories per day. Our civilian's elderly parent, already weakened by years of malnutrition, was now seriously ill. The chronic cough had worsened into what was likely tuberculosis, but obtaining medical care had become nearly impossible as the healthcare system collapsed under the combined pressures of war damage, resource scarcity, and administrative chaos. Fuel for heating was virtually non-existent. Our civilian's apartment remained unheated throughout the winter, with indoor temperatures barely above freezing. They burned furniture and books for warmth, a desperate measure that provided only brief respite from the cold. Water pipes throughout the city froze and burst, leaving most buildings without running water. Daily trips to public wells meant standing in long lines in freezing temperatures, carrying heavy containers back to apartments. The physical toll of these conditions was devastating. People moved slowly, conserving energy their bodies didn't have. Conversations became shorter as people lacked the strength for extended interactions. The city took on a ghostly quality, with fewer people on the streets and those who were out moving like shadows. The black market, which had provided essential supplementation to official rations, largely collapsed as supplies disappeared. Farmers in surrounding areas had little surplus to trade, and transportation difficulties made bringing goods into the city nearly impossible. What little was available commanded prices that most civilians couldn't afford. Our civilian traded away the last valuable items the household possessed: a watch, some silver cutlery, a wool coat, for small quantities of food that provided only temporary relief from hunger. The realization that there was nothing left to trade, no resources remaining to exchange for survival, created a particular desperation. Survival now depended entirely on the inadequate official rations and whatever could be scavenged or improvised. German soldiers in the city appeared increasingly demoralized and desperate. Some engaged in looting, taking what they wanted from civilian homes without pretense of legal authority. Others simply seemed to be waiting for orders that never came, uncertain about their future as the Reich collapsed around them. Our civilian witnessed German soldiers fighting among themselves, discipline breaking down as the command structure fragmented. This breakdown created new dangers, as desperate soldiers were unpredictable and potentially more violent than the organized occupation had been. At the same time, the weakening of German control created opportunities for resistance activities that would have been impossible earlier. The city existed in a strange liminal state, no longer fully under occupation, but not yet liberated. Rumors of approaching Allied forces circulated constantly, each one creating a surge of hope, followed by crushing disappointment when liberation didn't materialize. Our civilian heard reports that Soviet forces were approaching from the east, that American forces were advancing from the west, that liberation was days away. These rumors proved premature and the waiting continued. The psychological toll of hope repeatedly deferred added to the physical exhaustion of starvation and cold. People began to wonder if they would survive long enough to see liberation, or if they would die in these final weeks after enduring years of occupation. Our civilian's parent weakened daily, and the question became not if, but when death would come. The tragedy of surviving years of occupation, only to die in the final months, haunted many families during this desperate time. Yet even as conditions reached their worst, the knowledge that the occupation would end kept people struggling forward, day by difficult day. The first concrete signs of approaching liberation came through sounds rather than sights. Artillery fire rumbled in the distance, growing gradually closer over days and weeks. Our civilian could distinguish between the sounds of German and Allied artillery, a skill developed through years of living in a war zone. The approaching battle created a new kind of fear, as civilians understood they would be caught between retreating German forces and advancing Allied armies. The city might become a battlefield with all the dangers that entailed for those trapped within it. Some civilians tried to flee to the countryside, but most lacked the strength for such journeys and had nowhere to go. They had no choice but to remain and hope to survive the final confrontation. German forces began preparing defensive positions throughout the city. Soldiers dug trenches, erected barricades, and fortified buildings with machine gun positions. These preparations turned residential neighborhoods into military zones, with civilians ordered to evacuate certain areas or shelter in basements. Our civilians building received orders to remain indoors during daylight hours, as the streets were now considered combat zones. The windows were sandbagged to protect against shrapnel and bullets. The basement became the safest location, and residents gathered there with whatever supplies they had, preparing to wait out the battle. The atmosphere combined fear, exhaustion, and desperate hope that liberation would come quickly, and with minimal destruction. Some German units began withdrawing from the city as Allied forces approached, while others prepared to defend it. This created confusion about who was actually in control. Our civilian witnessed German convoys moving through the streets, vehicles loaded with soldiers and equipment heading away from the front lines. Other units moved in the opposite direction, heading toward defensive positions. Civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time risked being shot by nervous soldiers or caught in crossfire. The rules that had governed survival under occupation no longer applied, replaced by the chaos of military combat where civilians were simply obstacles or potential casualties rather than populations to be controlled. The electricity grid failed completely, plunging the city into darkness. Water supplies, already unreliable, stopped entirely. Our civilian's parent, now extremely weak and barely conscious, required constant care that was increasingly difficult to provide without water, heat, or adequate food. The question of whether to try to find medical help or stay sheltered became agonizing. Venturing out might mean being caught in combat or shot by retreating German soldiers, executing suspected resistance members in final acts of vengeance. Staying meant watching a loved one die without attempting to get help. Our civilian chose to stay, understanding that the chances of finding effective help were essentially zero, and that leaving would likely result in both of them dying rather than just one. The sounds of battle grew closer until they were immediate and overwhelming. Artillery shells exploded nearby, shaking the building's foundations. Machine gun fire rattled continuously. Civilians huddled in the basement, unable to see what was happening outside but hearing the war rage around them. The battle for the city lasted several days, each one feeling endless. Our civilian focused on keeping their parent as comfortable as possible, rationing the last scraps of food and water, and trying to maintain hope that they would survive just a bit longer. The parent died during the third night of fighting, passing quietly in the darkness of the basement while explosions echoed overhead. There was no possibility of proper burial or even moving the body. Our civilians sat with their parent's body in the darkness, surrounded by neighbors who were also struggling to survive, waiting for the fighting to end and wondering if liberation would come too late to matter. The fighting stopped suddenly. After days of constant artillery and gunfire, the silence felt almost unnatural. Our civilian and the other basement residents waited hours before anyone dared venture upstairs to investigate. When they finally emerged, they found their street transformed. Buildings bore damage from shell fire. Windows were shattered and debris littered the streets. German defensive positions sat abandoned, and in the distance they could see Allied soldiers moving through the city. The occupation was over. The realization brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief, exhaustion, grief for those who hadn't survived to see this day, and uncertainty about what would come next. Freedom had arrived, but the city and its people were broken. Allied soldiers entered the neighborhood cautiously, unsure of what resistance they might encounter. Our civilian and neighbors emerged from buildings, some waving white cloths to signal they were civilians. The soldiers were American, and they seemed shocked by the condition of the population. The hardest burden wasn't the fear of being caught or the constant hunger gnawing at his stomach. It was the silence he had to maintain about everything he witnessed. Every atrocity, every injustice, every moment of cruelty had to be swallowed and hidden behind a mask of compliance. He became an expert at controlling his facial expressions, at nodding at the right moments, at appearing indifferent when his heart screamed in protest. This internal conflict created a psychological toll that would haunt him for decades after the war ended. He developed what he later described as a double consciousness, where part of him performed the role of compliant citizen, while another part observed and remembered everything with crystal clarity. This mental compartmentalization was both a survival mechanism and a form of resistance. By remembering, by bearing witness internally, he preserved the truth that the regime tried to erase. He memorized faces of those who disappeared, locations of hidden activities, and details of conversations that revealed the machinery of oppression. His mind became an archive of forbidden knowledge. The psychological strain manifested in physical symptoms he couldn't fully hide. Insomnia became his constant companion, as nightmares blended with waking fears. He lost weight, despite his family's efforts to share what little food they had. His hands developed a tremor he had to consciously control in public. These physical manifestations of trauma were common among civilians living under occupation, though few could openly discuss them. The regime's control extended even into the realm of personal suffering, which had to be hidden to avoid appearing weak or disloyal. He found small ways to preserve his humanity and sanity. He would recite poetry silently in his head during propaganda rallies, creating a mental sanctuary the regime couldn't touch. He drew strength from memories of his life before the occupation, replaying conversations with family members and friends who had been taken away. These internal acts of resistance gave him purpose beyond mere survival. They reminded him that his identity existed independently of the role he was forced to play in public. As the war dragged on and the regime's grip tightened further, he noticed something shifting in the collective consciousness of his community. The fear remained. But underneath it, a different kind of awareness was growing. People were beginning to sense that the regime's promises of victory were hollow, that the end might be approaching. This realization brought both hope and terror, because the regime became more dangerous as its power waned. The question that haunted everyone was whether they would survive long enough to see liberation, and what that liberation might cost. Information became the most valuable commodity in a world where official news was pure propaganda. He learned to participate in what he called the network of whispers, an informal system through which real information spread despite the regime's control. A comment about bread prices might actually convey news about troop movements. A question about someone's health could be code for asking about resistance activities. This shadow communication system operated in plain sight, invisible to those who didn't know how to listen. It required trust, discretion, and the ability to read between lines of seemingly innocent conversation. The network connected people across different parts of the city and even beyond. A baker might pass information to a customer, who would relay it to a factory worker, who would share it with someone who had connections in another district. The chain was deliberately fragmented so that no single person knew the complete picture. This structure protected everyone involved, as interrogation could only reveal small pieces of a larger puzzle. He became a link in several of these chains, carefully managing what he knew and what he shared, to minimize risk while maximizing the flow of crucial information. The most valuable information concerned the war's progress, which the regime systematically misrepresented. While official broadcasts proclaimed endless victories, the Whisper Network revealed the truth. The regime was losing ground, suffering devastating defeats, and running out of resources. This knowledge provided hope, but also increased danger, as the regime became more brutal in its efforts to maintain control. Knowing the truth meant living with the constant temptation to act on it, to do something that might hasten the regime's end, even though such actions would likely result in immediate execution. He witnessed the network's power when false information was deliberately introduced to test for informants. A rumor about a planned resistance action would be shared with a small group, and if raids occurred, everyone knew someone in that group had betrayed them. This brutal but necessary process helped identify collaborators and protect genuine resistance activities. He participated in these tests reluctantly, understanding their necessity but hating the paranoia they generated. Trust became both essential and nearly impossible, a paradox that defined life under occupation. The psychological complexity of navigating these networks while maintaining his public facade of compliance created immense stress. He had to remember who knew what, who could be trusted with which information, and how to communicate without leaving evidence. Every conversation became a calculated risk, every relationship a potential threat or lifeline. Yet this network of whispers represented something the regime could never fully destroy: the human need to connect, to share truth, and to resist dehumanization. As the regime's end approached, this network would prove crucial not just for survival, but for the preservation of accurate history, the impact of the regime on children was particularly devastating to witness. He saw an entire generation being shaped by propaganda, fear, and deprivation. Schools became indoctrination centers where children were taught to report on their parents, to glorify the regime, and to embrace ideologies of hatred. Young minds were molded to see the world through the regime's twisted lens, and he watched helplessly as children who should have been learning mathematics and literature were instead being trained as instruments of oppression. The theft of childhood innocence was one of the regime's most unforgivable crimes. Some parents attempted to counter the indoctrination at home, whispering alternative truths to their children in moments of privacy. But this created a terrible burden for young people who had to maintain separate realities, the regime's version at school and in public, their family's version at home. Children learned to lie convincingly at ages when they should have been learning to trust. He observed how this fractured reality damaged young psyches, creating confusion and anxiety that manifested in behavioral problems the regime blamed on weak parenting rather than its own policies. The regime also exploited children's natural enthusiasm and desire to belong by creating youth organizations that combined social activities with ideological training. These groups offered structure, purpose, and community to young people who had known nothing but chaos and war. He understood why children were drawn to them, even as he mourned what they were becoming. Some families had no choice but to allow their children to participate, as refusing could mark the entire family as disloyal. The regime's manipulation of natural human needs for belonging and purpose was particularly insidious when directed at children. He made quiet efforts to preserve some sense of normalcy and genuine education for children in his community. When opportunities arose, he would share stories from before the occupation, talk about ideas and values that contradicted regime propaganda, and try to plant seeds of critical thinking that might survive until liberation. These efforts were dangerous and had to be carefully disguised as harmless entertainment or innocent conversation. He never knew if his words made any difference, but he felt compelled to try, to offer some counterweight to the constant barrage of propaganda. As the war's end approached, he worried deeply about what would become of the children who had known nothing but occupation. How would they adjust to freedom? How would they unlearn the hatred and fear that had been drilled into them? Would they be able to trust adults who had either collaborated with or failed to effectively resist the regime? These questions haunted him as he observed children playing war games that mimicked real violence, using language of hatred as casually as he once used words of affection. The regime's legacy would extend far beyond its political defeat, living on in the damaged psyches of an entire generation. The last winter under occupation was the harshest in every sense. Resources that had been scarce became nearly non-existent as the regime prioritized its military over civilian needs. Fuel for heating disappeared, food rations were cut again, and basic services collapsed. He watched people freeze to death in their homes, saw children with frostbite because they lacked proper clothing, and witnessed the elderly simply give up, lacking the strength to endure another day of cold and hunger. The physical suffering reached levels that seemed designed to break whatever spirit remained in the civilian population. Yet, paradoxically, this final winter also brought signs that the occupation might end. The regime's propaganda became more desperate and obviously false. Soldiers appeared younger and more poorly trained, clearly scraped from the bottom of available manpower. Equipment broke down and wasn't replaced. The efficient machinery of oppression began to sputter and malfunction, creating small spaces where people could breathe slightly easier. He recognized these signs from the Whisper Network's intelligence and from his own observations, but he also knew that a dying regime could be more dangerous than a confident one. The regime responded to its weakening position with increased brutality. Mass executions became more frequent, targeting anyone suspected of disloyalty or a resistance. The criteria for suspicion became arbitrary and capricious as paranoid officials lashed out at phantom threats. He witnessed public hangings meant to terrorize the population into continued submission, but instead they revealed the regime's desperation. People who had been too frightened to resist before began taking small risks, hiding refugees, sharing food despite hoarding laws, and whispering more openly about liberation. The balance of fear was shifting. He struggled with the question of whether to take more active risks now that the end seemed near. Part of him wanted to do something meaningful, to be able to say he had actively resisted rather than merely survived. But another part recognized that dying in the final weeks of occupation would be a tragic waste, that survival itself remained the most important goal. He watched others make different choices, some joining active resistance that cost them their lives just days before liberation, others maintaining their cautious approach until the very end. There was no clear right answer, only individual decisions made under impossible circumstances. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, the atmosphere became electric with anticipation and dread. Everyone could sense that something was coming, that the current situation couldn't continue much longer. The regime's control was fraying visibly, but it still possessed the power to kill. He found himself caught between hope and fear, between the desire to see liberation and the terror that he might not survive to witness it. The waiting became almost unbearable, each day stretching endlessly as he wondered if this would be the day everything changed, or the day his luck finally ran out. The first concrete signs that liberation forces were approaching came not from official sources, but through the whisper network and personal observation. Distant sounds of artillery grew gradually louder over days and weeks. The regime imposed stricter curfews and movement restrictions, a clear sign they feared the population might rise up to help liberating forces. He noticed regime officials beginning to destroy documents and pack belongings, preparing for retreat or escape. These signs filled him with hope, tempered by extreme caution, as he knew the regime might commit final atrocities before abandoning control. The regime's propaganda reached absurd levels of denial, claiming victories even as everyone could hear battles drawing closer. Loudspeakers that had broadcast endless propaganda for years now played martial music interspersed with increasingly frantic calls for loyalty and warnings about enemy brutality. He found dark humor in the regime's desperation, but he also recognized the danger of cornered predators. The officials who remained were often the most fanatical or those with too much blood on their hands to hope for mercy, making them unpredictable and dangerous. He faced agonizing decisions about how to position himself for liberation. Should he hide and wait for it to pass over him? Or should he try to help the liberating forces when they arrived? What if he was caught in crossfire between retreating regime forces and advancing liberators? What if the regime decided to execute prisoners and suspected resistors before fleeing? These questions kept him awake during the long nights as artillery sounds grew louder. He made plans and backup plans, identifying hiding places, escape routes, and supplies he might need to survive the transition period. The civilian population's behavior began to change in subtle but significant ways. People who had avoided eye contact for years now exchanged knowing glances. Small acts of defiance increased as individuals calculated that the regime no longer had time to track down every minor infraction. He witnessed someone tear down a propaganda poster without looking around fearfully afterward, a tiny act that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. These small rebellions created a sense of collective awakening, as if the entire city was slowly standing up after years of being forced to kneel. As liberation forces drew within a few miles of the city, the situation became chaotic and extremely dangerous. Regime forces began a fighting retreat, sometimes using civilians as shields or hostages. He heard gunfire in nearby streets and saw smoke rising from burning buildings. The regime was destroying what it couldn't take and killing those it considered enemies. He hunkered down with his family, trying to make themselves invisible during these final violent hours. The wait for liberation had become a desperate struggle to survive just a little longer, to not die within sight of freedom after enduring so much. Liberation arrived not with a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual realization that the oppressors were gone and new forces had arrived. He first noticed the absence of regime patrols that had been constant for years. Then came the sound of different vehicles, different languages being shouted in the streets. He cautiously looked outside to see civilians emerging from buildings, moving hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The liberating forces were focused on securing the area and pursuing retreating regime units, paying little attention to civilians who were simply trying to comprehend that their ordeal had ended. The initial hours of liberation were confusing, and emotionally overwhelming. He felt relief so intense. It was physically painful, mixed with disbelief that he had actually survived. Around him, people reacted in vastly different ways. Some wept openly, others stood in stunned silence, still others erupted in celebration. He found himself unable to fully process what was happening, his mind still operating in survival mode, even though the immediate threat had passed. Years of suppressed emotions began to surface, but he felt numb, disconnected from the joy he thought he should feel. The liberating forces brought food, medical supplies, and most importantly, the end of systematic terror. But they also brought new complications. The city was damaged, infrastructure was destroyed, and the population was traumatized and suspicious. He watched as people struggled to interact with the liberators, years of fear making it difficult to trust anyone in uniform, even those who had freed them. The liberators themselves seemed shocked by the conditions they found, by the extent of deprivation and brutality the population had endured. He saw in their faces a recognition of horrors that words couldn't adequately convey. As the initial chaos settled into a new kind of order, he began to confront what liberation actually meant. Freedom from oppression, yes, but also freedom to remember, to grieve, to acknowledge everything that had been lost. He learned the fates of friends and family members who had disappeared, confirming what he had feared, but hoped wasn't true. The full scale of the regime's crimes became apparent as mass graves were discovered and survivors shared their stories. Liberation brought not just relief, but also a reckoning with trauma that had been suppressed for years. He also witnessed the complicated aftermath of occupation as the community dealt with collaborators. Some who had worked with the regime were arrested by liberating forces, while others faced rough justice from angry civilians. He understood the rage that drove people to revenge, but he also recognized that not everyone who had collaborated had done so willingly, that survival had required compromises from everyone. The moral clarity of resistance versus collaboration blurred when examined closely. These were questions that would haunt his community for generations, questions about guilt, forgiveness, and how to rebuild a society fractured by years of oppression. The months following liberation were in some ways harder than the occupation itself. During the occupation, survival had been the singular focus, providing clear purpose despite the horror. Now he had to figure out how to actually live, how to build a future when the past was full of trauma and loss. His home was damaged, his community was scattered, and many of the people he had cared about were dead. The economic system had collapsed, leaving everyone scrambling for basic necessities, even though the immediate threat of violence had ended. He struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, though that terminology didn't exist then. Nightmares plagued his sleep, and sudden noises sent him into panic. He found it difficult to make simple decisions, as years of hypervigilance had exhausted his capacity for normal choice-making. Crowds made him anxious, authority figures triggered fear responses, and he constantly scanned his environment for threats that no longer existed. These reactions were common among survivors, but there were few resources for mental health treatment in the devastated, post-war landscape. Rebuilding required not just physical reconstruction, but also social healing. His community had been fractured by years of suspicion, collaboration, and betrayal. Trust had to be painstakingly rebuilt, and that process was complicated by the need to determine how to treat those who had collaborated with the regime. Some argued for harsh punishment, others for reconciliation and forgiveness. He found himself somewhere in the middle, believing in accountability, but also recognizing that survival under occupation had required compromises from everyone. These debates were painful and divisive, but they were also necessary for moving forward. He made a conscious decision to bear witness to what had happened, to ensure that the truth would be preserved and remembered. He began writing down his experiences and those of others, collecting testimonies and documents before they could be lost. This work became his way of processing trauma, while also serving a larger purpose. He believed that future generations needed to understand what had happened, not just the broad historical facts, but the daily reality of living under totalitarian oppression. His accounts focused on the small details that official histories might overlook: the texture of fear, the moral complexity of survival, the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. As years passed and life gradually normalized, he found ways to build meaning from his experience. He connected with other survivors, forming bonds based on shared understanding that no one else could fully grasp. He worked to help younger generations understand the fragility of freedom and the importance of resisting the early signs of authoritarianism. He never fully recovered from the trauma of those years, but he learned to live with it, to integrate it into his identity rather than being consumed by it. His survival was not just physical, but also moral and psychological, a testament to human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. Looking back on his experience decades later, he reflected on what survival under the Nazi regime had taught him about human nature and society. He had witnessed the worst of humanity, the capacity for cruelty, the ease with which ordinary people could be turned into instruments of oppression, and the fragility of civilization when confronted with organized evil. But he had also witnessed the best, the courage of those who resisted, the compassion of those who helped others at great personal risk, and the resilience of the human spirit under conditions designed to break it. One of his most important insights was about the gradual nature of totalitarian control. The regime didn't arrive fully formed. It built its power incrementally, normalizing each new restriction before imposing the next. He emphasized in his testimonies that the time to resist authoritarianism is at the beginning, when the costs are lower and the outcome is less certain. By the time the regime's true nature was fully apparent, resistance had become nearly impossible, and survival required compromises that would haunt people for the rest of their lives. This lesson felt urgently relevant as he watched new authoritarian movements emerge in various parts of the world. He also reflected on the moral complexity of survival under oppression. It was easy for those who hadn't experienced it to judge the choices people made, to ask why there wasn't more resistance or why people complied with unjust orders. But he knew that survival required constant moral compromise, that the line between collaboration and resistance was often blurred, and that judging others' choices from a position of safety was both arrogant and ignorant. He advocated for understanding the context of survival without excusing genuine atrocities, a nuanced position that didn't fit neatly into simple narratives of heroes and villains. His legacy included not just his written testimonies, but also his efforts to educate younger generations. He spoke at schools and community events, always emphasizing the human details that made history real rather than abstract. He wanted young people to understand that the victims and perpetrators of World War II atrocities were real individuals, not historical abstractions. He believed that personalizing history was the best defense against its repetition, that understanding the lived experience of oppression created empathy and vigilance that statistics and dates could not. In his final years, he found some measure of peace in knowing that his story had been preserved and shared. He had survived not just physically, but in a way that honored those who didn't, by ensuring their experiences wouldn't be forgotten. His life stood as testimony to the human capacity to endure unimaginable circumstances while retaining fundamental humanity. For those seeking to understand how ordinary people survived extraordinary evil, his story offers no simple lessons or comfortable conclusions, only the complex truth of one person's journey through one of history's darkest periods. His survival was both ordinary and remarkable, a reminder that history is made of individual lives, individual choices, and individual acts of courage and compromise.